Tony thought Lori was weak. He filed for divorce while she was lying in a hospital bed, laughing with his friends about finally getting rid of her. But he had no idea that her $250 million inheritance was about to rip his life apart. Lori wasn't just going to let him walk away. She's about to hit him where it hurts most. And he doesn't see it coming. Lori lay motionless in her hospital bed, the quiet hum of machines filling the otherwise still room. Her body ached, every inch of it still recovering from the horrific accident that had nearly cost her everything. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight that pressed down on her chest, the heaviness of a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could. For years, Lori had been living in a fog. She had married Tony Wallace, thinking that their love was enough, thinking that together they could build a life, a future. She had given him everything, her love, her trust, her support. But the moment she had overheard him laughing about the divorce, the moment she had realized that she was no longer an important part of his life, only a means to an end, everything changed. Let me break it down. Tony had been using her all along. He wasn't just her husband, he was a parasite feeding off her wealth, her family legacy, and the life they had built together. And while she lay there in that sterile hospital room, vulnerable and incapacitated, Tony had laughed about leaving her while she was incapacitated, while she couldn't defend herself. His lack of empathy and care made it crystal clear he never loved her. He loved what she could give him. But Lori had spent too long living in the shadow of someone else's needs, too long thinking that her value was tied to how much she could offer to the man she had loved. No more. She wasn't going to stay stuck in that moment of betrayal. She wasn't going to fall apart because of Tony's heartless actions. Lori had learned something that day, something that had slowly started to sink into her bones as she lay there, staring at the white ceiling of her hospital room. She was stronger than she realized, and she wasn't going to let Tony or anyone take that away from her again. The next few days were a blur of medical visits, physical therapy, and her attempts to steady her emotions. Lori was used to being the pillar, the one who took care of everything, the one who held everything together. It was in her nature. But now, with Tony's betrayal fresh in her mind, she realized that the one thing she had neglected for years was her own independence. She had given everything, but it was time to take something back for herself. She had spent too long being a supporting character in her own story. Now, it was her time to take the lead. Lori knew the first thing she needed to do: secure her inheritance. Tony had no idea what she had been hiding, and Lori wasn't going to let his greed destroy her future. The $250 Tatum family fortune was hers, not Tony's. But Tony wasn't just after her money, he was after her freedom, her life. He wanted to leave her vulnerable, and Lori wouldn't let him. The Tatum wealth wasn't something Lori had ever flaunted or used. It was always there, a silent presence, a reminder that she came from a lineage of self-sufficiency and strength. But Lori never wanted to be seen as just another woman with money. She wanted to be known for who she was as a person, not the fortune that had been left to her. She didn't want Tony to ever see her as someone he could take advantage of, someone who was easy to manipulate for her wealth. So, Lori began making plans. Quiet plans. Calculated ones. She picked up her phone one evening when she knew Tony wouldn't be around. The conversations from the previous days had left her exhausted, but this time, there was a sense of calmness in her as she dialed the number she had been avoiding for years. "Matt Juggernaut," she said as soon as the lawyer picked up. "I need your help." Matt's voice came through clear and steady. "What's going on, Lori?" "I need to secure my assets," she replied, her voice firm. "I need to move my inheritance out of reach. Tony has no idea what he's dealing with, but I can't let him get his hands on it. It's time to take control of my life." Matt paused for a moment, and then Lori heard him shift into his professional mode. "I'll help you. We'll start the process immediately. But Lori, you need to understand that we'll have to move quickly. Once he finds out, it'll be too late." "I understand," she said, her jaw set. "I'm not going to let him walk away with everything. This is my time to take back control. For the first time in my life, I'm going to be the one who decides." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings with attorneys. Lori had her trust fund moved into a private account, one that Tony had no access to. She made sure that the money was legally protected, that it would remain hers and hers alone. The Tatum family legacy was now secure. But Lori didn't just stop there. She also began the legal process of securing a separate legal residence for herself. She was done with the house they had lived in together. It had once been a symbol of their life, their future. But now it was nothing more than a reminder of the lies Tony had told her, a house built on a false foundation. Lori wasn't going to live in that house anymore. She wasn't going to live with Tony's shadow hanging over her. She began making plans for her own future, one that had nothing to do with Tony. She called up old business contacts, former associates, people who could help her launch a venture of her own. This was her moment. She wasn't going to sit in the hospital bed, waiting for things to get better. She was going to make them better on her own terms. Lori had always dreamed of opening her own business, and now, with her inheritance secure, she had the financial freedom to do it. Her father had always encouraged her to follow her own path, to make her own decisions, and now she finally felt ready to take that advice to heart. The real estate development project she'd been dreaming about for years was now within her reach. Lori planned to focus on women's empowerment and create spaces that could help women build careers, businesses, and lives that weren't dependent on anyone but themselves. She was going to invest in community-driven projects, places where women could thrive just like she was about to. But it wasn't just about business, it was about freedom. For the first time in her life, Lori was going to choose what she wanted to do, not what anyone else expected of her. Days turned into weeks, and Lori's plans began to fall into place. Tony continued to come and go, blissfully unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. Lori no longer had the emotional attachment to him that had once made her feel like she had to justify her actions. She didn't owe him anything. One night, as she sat at her desk, reviewing plans for her new business, Lori realized something. She had done it. She had built a life for herself without Tony. Her wealth was now her own, not something to be fought over, not something to be shared with someone who had never truly cared about her. She sat back in her chair, eyes drifting to the window where the last traces of daylight flickered across the sky. It felt like a quiet victory, a subtle kind of strength that didn't need to be broadcast to the world. "I am more than just the woman who feeds him," she whispered to herself, a soft smile curling on her lips. "I am the woman who controls her destiny." And for the first time in years, Lori truly believed it. Lori Tatum sat in her hospital bed, the cool sheet beneath her body doing little to ease the tension that knotted her muscles. Her eyes were focused on the plain white walls, but her mind was far away, spinning, calculating, dissecting everything she had been through in the past few days. She could still hear the echo of Tony's voice, his laughter, taunting her as he thought she was too weak to notice. His freedom, his laugh at her expense, his claim to be free had shattered her illusions. But now that Lori had seen the truth, she knew she would never let him take everything from her, not her wealth, not her future. Her father, Joseph Tatum, had built a dynasty, a fortune worth $250 million, and Lori was the sole beneficiary. He'd left it to her in a trust, carefully constructed so that it couldn't be touched by anyone, especially not Tony, who had no clue about its existence. Lori had been keeping that secret for years, hiding her inheritance from Tony because she feared his intentions would shift if he knew. She hadn't wanted him to love her for the money, and she had believed that sharing the truth would change everything. But now, after hearing him so casually laugh about the divorce and discuss her like she was some form of obstacle to be discarded, Lori realized she had been wrong. She had hidden the truth about her wealth from the man who, for years, had been using her as a stepping stone for his own personal gain. The moment she overheard him planning to leave her while she was at her most vulnerable, Lori understood that Tony was not someone she could continue to trust. What hurt even more than the divorce, than his betrayal, was the recklessness of his behavior. He didn't even know what he was walking away from. Lori wasn't about to let him ruin her future, not when she had a legacy, a financial foundation far more solid than Tony could ever dream of. The door to her hospital room creaked open, and Lori's attention shifted to the figure that stepped inside. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when everything would shift into motion. Matt Juggernaut, her attorney, stood there, his silhouette framed by the doorway. His calm demeanor and sharp suit contrasted with the sterile whiteness of the room, but Lori felt a small flicker of relief when she saw him. "Lori," Matt greeted her, his voice low and soothing. "How are you feeling?" Lori didn't answer right away. She wasn't interested in small talk, not when the stakes had just gotten so much higher. Instead, she met his gaze steadily. "I'm ready to take action." Matt didn't hesitate. He'd known Lori for years. He knew how her mind worked, how she would never settle for anything less than complete control. "Good," Matt said, his voice steady as always. He walked over to the chair beside her bed and sat down, pulling out a thick envelope from his leather briefcase. Lori noticed that it was sealed with the firm's logo. The Tatum Family Estate's legal team had already done their work. Matt opened the envelope, extracting the paperwork and spreading it out in front of Lori. His tone became more serious, his eyes scanning the documents. "Lori, your father's estate is bulletproof," he began. "You've been the sole beneficiary of everything Joseph Tatum left behind. It's all under your name, under the trust he set up for you. Tony has no claim to any of it. Not now, not ever. No divorce papers, no demands, nothing can touch it." Lori's pulse quickened as the weight of those words sank in. For so long she'd kept the wealth hidden, not just from Tony, but from everyone. But now, as Matt confirmed what she already knew, a flood of relief washed over her. This was her inheritance, and Tony had no idea what he was about to face. Tony had spent years thinking Lori was a helpless wife, an asset he could manipulate. He thought he could walk away and leave her with nothing. What he didn't know was that Lori's father had anticipated everything, every threat, every possible move Tony could make, and he had safeguarded her future. Lori felt something rise inside her, a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in a long time. Her father had prepared her for this. Tony had made his choice. And now, Lori was going to make hers. "I've already started the paperwork," Matt continued, his voice cutting through Lori's thoughts. "We're moving your assets into separate accounts, accounts that Tony cannot touch. I've also contacted the trustees, and everything is being moved into a private fund for you. This will ensure that there's no access to the money, no matter what Tony tries. He won't even get close to it." Lori nodded, the weight lifting off her shoulders. "I've been preparing for this," she said, her voice steady. "But I can't just protect the money, Matt. I need to protect myself. I can't let him take me down with him." Matt leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "Lori, you've already protected yourself. This is about more than money now. This is about securing your future. You've already made the first move." The confidence in his words calmed Lori's nerves, though the reality of her situation still gnawed at her. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance, she was protecting her dignity. Tony had crossed a line, and Lori wasn't about to let him control her life anymore. "Then what's next?" Lori asked. Matt smiled faintly. "Next, we send the divorce papers to Tony's attorney. The moment he receives them, he'll know that his plans are worthless. Everything he's been banking on, the wealth, the life he thought he'd walk away with, it's gone. You'll walk away with everything he thought was his." The next few weeks were a blur of legal procedures, phone calls, and meetings. Lori wasn't just sitting back while Tony made decisions for her life. No, she was taking the reins. Each conversation with Matt brought her closer to securing everything she had spent so long protecting. She moved her money into private accounts that were untouchable, accounts that were completely shielded from any claims Tony might make. The family's wealth, which Lori had once kept hidden, was now her greatest strength. Lori had been more than just the woman who fed Tony. She had been the one who carried their lives, the one who had provided for them in ways Tony had never truly appreciated. But now, she was no longer the support system, she was the architect of her own future, and this was just the beginning. In the middle of all this, Tony had his own plans, of course. He wasn't going to let Lori take control without a fight. As Lori worked through the logistics of securing her future, Tony kept up his appearances. He showed up at the house occasionally, always with a new excuse: business meetings, friends, the gym. But Lori saw through it all now. His mask had slipped. She knew who he really was, and she wasn't going to be fooled by his empty promises. When Tony came to her one evening, trying to explain his actions with half-hearted excuses, Lori was ready. Her composure was unwavering as she listened to him try to manipulate the situation. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, Lori," he said, standing at the foot of her hospital bed looking at her as if she were still the woman who had loved him unconditionally. But Lori wasn't that woman anymore. She was no longer afraid of losing him. "No, Tony," she said, her voice firm. "You've always cared about what you could take from me. You never loved me. You loved the life I gave you. But now that life is over." Tony's face twisted with confusion and frustration, but Lori didn't flinch. She was done with him. He no longer had any power over her. "You're done here, Tony," Lori continued, "and I'm done giving you everything. I've been living in your shadow for too long. I'm done playing small. And now, I'm taking control of my life, my future, my wealth. You won't get a cent, and you won't have access to a thing." Tony's eyes widened with disbelief, but Lori was resolute. "You don't get to take anything from me anymore." The sterile light of the hospital room felt harsh against Lori's skin. Each movement she made seemed to rip through her consciousness, a reminder of everything she had lost and what she was about to reclaim. The words that had echoed through her mind for days still burned like a brand, and now, as Tony walked into the room once more, Lori realized it was time to put an end to the quiet suffering. He had come earlier that morning, pretending to be concerned, asking if she needed anything. But Lori had seen through him, as she always did. His affection had always been conditional. His attempts at kindness now felt hollow, too little, too late. Lori had long known that she had been a means to an end for Tony. The wealth, the life he thought he could inherit, by simply being married to her, he had always seen her as a tool, never as a partner. The door opened, and there he was again. Tony Wallace, with his perfectly tailored suit, his shoes gleaming like he had stepped off a fashion magazine cover, his smile already slipping into place. He was playing the part, the good husband, the man who had everything under control. But Lori could see through it all. "You're looking better," Tony said, stepping into the room. His voice was smooth, but Lori could see the discomfort in his eyes. He wasn't used to seeing her like this, broken, vulnerable. Weak, he had likely been thinking. But the truth was, she wasn't weak. She had been quiet, holding on to her power, her wealth, and her self-respect. But now, it was time to take it all back. Lori turned her head slowly toward him, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm. Too calm. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel betrayed in the way most people might have. Instead, there was only clarity. Tony took a step closer to her bed, his hands clasped in front of him. "I know this has been hard for you, Lori, but we're going to get through this. We always do, right?" His words were empty, but they still carried the same arrogance that had led him to believe he could control her, that he could walk away with everything without consequences. Lori inhaled deeply, allowing the silence to stretch out between them. This was the moment where everything she had kept inside her would finally come to light. She wasn't going to shout. She wasn't going to beg. That wasn't her anymore. This was going to be different. Let me break it down. Lori had been hiding so much from Tony for so long, not just her father's wealth, but her power. The strength to take control of her own future had always been hers. Tony never realized the full extent of what he was up against, and Lori had let him believe that he could take whatever he wanted. But now, that was over. She was done playing by his rules. "I don't need you, Tony," Lori said, her voice low but filled with undeniable strength. "Not now, not ever. You've made it clear how little you think of me, of our marriage. You don't get to walk away from this, not without consequences." Tony blinked, clearly caught off guard by her sudden shift in tone. He hadn't expected this. He was used to the quiet Lori, the one who stood by him even when he treated her like a second-class citizen, the woman who had allowed him to take advantage of her, to use her wealth as his own. But now, it was as if Lori had become someone he didn't recognize, someone stronger. "I don't know what you mean, Lori," Tony stammered, taking a step back. His demeanor had shifted, the mask of control slipping as the tension in the room grew thicker. "We've been through tough times. You know, I've always been there for you." Lori couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, cold sound that surprised even her. "No, Tony, you've never been there for me. You've only been there for what you could get. You never cared about me. You cared about the life you could build by being with me. And now, with your betrayal exposed, you think you can just walk away?" Tony's face reddened as he stumbled to find the right words. "Lori, I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to make things easier for both of us. You know how it's been. The money's been tight and—" "Stop," Lori cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended, but it felt good to interrupt him, to stop him from spinning his lies any longer. "You didn't care about me, Tony. You cared about what I could give you, and when I couldn't give you that anymore, you decided I was no longer worth your time." His eyes widened in shock as Lori continued, each word cutting deeper than the last. "But let me tell you something, Tony," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You can leave. You can file for divorce. You can laugh about it all you want. But this marriage was never about you. It was about me. It was about what I allowed you to have. And now you'll see how little you really have." Tony recoiled, his face drained of color. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are you saying?" Lori leaned back against her pillows, the pain from the accident momentarily forgotten. Her father's $250M inheritance was finally in her hands, and Tony didn't even know it yet. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he had no idea what was coming. "I'm saying that you have no idea who you're dealing with," Lori said, her words deliberate and clear. "I've been silent long enough, but I'm not your punching bag anymore, Tony. I'm done letting you take what's mine, and you'll never get a cent of what's been left for me. I'm not just a woman who feeds you, a woman who supports you. I'm the woman who controls her own destiny." Lori's words hung in the air, thick with finality. For a long moment, Tony just stood there, his mouth agape, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't the woman he had married. This wasn't the woman he had thought he could walk all over. He had no idea what Lori had been hiding, no idea about the trust, about the wealth she controlled, and when the truth came crashing down, it would not be a confrontation, it would be a reckoning. But Lori wasn't going to wait around for Tony to figure it out. She wasn't going to let him twist her reality any longer. He had made his decision, and now it was time for her to make hers. "I want you to leave," Lori said quietly, her voice calm but unwavering. "I want you out of this hospital room, out of my life, and out of my future." Tony looked like he might say something, but Lori didn't wait for him to respond. She had already made her decision. She was done. Lori's quiet strength was already starting to take form. It wasn't in the way she fought or shouted, but in the way she stood her ground. Her family's $250M inheritance had always been a silent force, a legacy she had kept hidden because she feared it would only attract the wrong kind of attention. But now, it was her shield, her armor. The thing that would protect her from the man who had never seen her for who she truly was. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and consultations with Matt Juggernaut. Lori moved quickly, securing her wealth, placing it in accounts Tony couldn't touch. She began to map out her next steps, not just for the divorce, but for her future. She wasn't going to let Tony drag her down any longer. And as she signed the legal documents that would free her from him for good, Lori knew that her life was about to change. She was about to step into a future of her own making, no longer dependent on anyone but herself. Later that week, Lori made a visit to the Tatum family estate, a place she hadn't been to in years. It had always been her sanctuary, the one place that still felt like home. Her father's legacy was all around her, from the large portrait of Joseph Tatum hanging over the fireplace to the stately library where he had spent countless hours working on his business empire. It was a reminder of everything she had inherited, everything she had. Lori walked through the grand halls, her sisters, Reeve and Rhea, by her side. Their presence was comforting, a reminder that no matter what happened with Tony, she was never truly alone. As Lori gazed out over the sprawling estate, she realized something. Loyalty was what mattered. Her father had always said that family was everything, that love, trust, and loyalty built empires. And no matter what happened with Tony, Lori knew that the only thing she could truly depend on was her family. "I'm not doing this alone," Lori whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I never was." Reeve put her arm around Lori's shoulders, her face soft with understanding. "You've always been strong, Lori," she said. "You don't need him to be happy." Lori smiled, grateful for her sister's support. "I'm starting to realize that." Lori's mind was sharp and focused now, every decision she made rooted in a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. The anger she had once felt for Tony's betrayal was there, but it was distant, like a fading storm cloud that had passed its peak. Now, what remained was a calm, cold resolve. Lori wasn't fighting for revenge. No, this wasn't about winning some petty war with Tony. This was about reclaiming her life. And for the first time, it wasn't about fighting him. It was about securing her future. The days following her confrontation with Tony were filled with quiet, determined action. Lori didn't cry, she didn't shout, and she certainly didn't wallow. She had work to do. The hospital room, the sterile environment, the painful memories, they were all starting to feel like a distant part of her past. She no longer felt trapped in a marriage that had never truly been hers. Now, she had purpose, and that purpose was not just about financial freedom, it was about personal redemption. Lori's first step was to ensure her $250M inheritance was locked down. She had always known the Tatum family wealth was there, quietly building over time, but now it was more than just money. It was her weapon, her shield, and her safety net. For years, she had let Tony believe that he was the one controlling their marriage, controlling their lives. He thought she was weak, but that was all about to change. A few days after their confrontation, Lori sat across from Matt Juggernaut, her trusted lawyer. He had been the one to handle her father's estate when Joseph Tatum passed away, and he was the only person Lori trusted to protect her wealth. "Matt, I'm ready," Lori said, her voice steady. "I need to move everything. Now." Matt gave her a sharp nod, his eyes assessing her carefully. "Understood. But Lori, you have to know what we do next will be difficult. Tony will fight for this money, and he won't give up easily." Lori didn't flinch. "I'm not worried about him," she said simply, her eyes unwavering. "He's already lost. He doesn't even know it yet." Matt smiled slightly, impressed by her calm confidence. He was used to people breaking down after moments of betrayal, but Lori wasn't like most people. She was more than capable of holding her ground. And it wasn't just about money, it was about strength. And Lori knew the game she was about to play was one she was going to win. "I've already made arrangements," Matt continued. "We'll transfer everything into separate accounts, and I'll make sure Tony has no access to it. The trust will be secure, and he won't be able to touch a penny." Lori nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. "Good. I also want to make sure that the house is under my name only. I'll start the process of transferring ownership immediately. Tony can keep his things, but I won't let him take this from me." Matt scribbled down a few notes, making arrangements in his head. He knew Lori wasn't just protecting her wealth, she was building a life on her own terms. She didn't need Tony, and she was done pretending she did. She was no longer the woman who stood by, watching her life slip away. Now, she was the one in control. The weeks following were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and constant restructuring of Lori's assets. Every part of her life, every inch of her inheritance, was being reclaimed and reallocated into places Tony couldn't touch. It was like a wall being built around her, one block at a time, as Lori began her journey toward full independence. But it wasn't all about the legal steps. Lori knew that her true power lay in her ability to think beyond the money. This wasn't just about financial control, it was about emotional and personal freedom. Lori had spent years playing the role of the dutiful wife, giving Tony everything she had, but in return, he had taken her love and turned it into something transactional. Now, it was time for her to reclaim herself, and part of that meant building a future that didn't include him. As the legal processes moved forward, Lori began to see the full picture of her family's wealth and legacy. Her father had always been meticulous in his planning, making sure that the Tatum family fortune was shielded from outside influence. And now, all that planning was paying off. Lori had access to the entire estate and not just the money. She had properties, businesses, and an entire network of investments that had been growing silently for decades. But she didn't want just the inheritance. Lori wanted to create her own empire, something that would give her a sense of purpose beyond the wealth she had inherited. It was time for Lori to step out from the shadow of her father's legacy and make her mark on the world. One evening, after a long day of paperwork, Lori walked into the room where her family's real estate holdings were discussed. Her sisters, Reeve and Rhea, were sitting at the table, discussing their next moves. The room was filled with the quiet hum of family business. Nothing had changed. Lori paused at the door, listening for a moment. She had always been the quiet one, the one who observed and took everything in before making decisions. But tonight, something was different. The world outside was changing, and Lori was about to change with it. "Are you sure you want to do this, Lori?" Rev asked, glancing up at her sister. "I know Tony has hurt you, but it's a big step." Lori smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about freedom. Freedom to be herself, to create a future that was completely her own. "I've already made my decision," Lori replied. "I'm not going to let him dictate my life anymore." Rhea, always the practical one, raised an eyebrow. "You're going to fight him, aren't you?" Lori nodded slowly. "Yes, but it's not just about him, it's about me. I'm not going to let anyone take control of what's mine. It's time to start building my future, one that's not tied to him, one that's all mine." Lori spent the next several days poring over plans for her future. She started to look into new real estate projects, specifically focusing on women's empowerment, a passion she'd held for years but had never fully pursued. She began to make calls, meeting with potential partners and investors who shared her vision. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for things to fall into place. She was going to make it happen. It was time for her to create her own empire. And as the days went by, Lori felt a sense of exhilaration that she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer waiting for someone else to make decisions for her. She was leading. But even as Lori forged ahead, she couldn't ignore the looming shadow of Tony. He hadn't stopped trying to reach her. There were the daily texts, the constant calls, the endless apologies. But Lori was no longer swayed by his empty promises. She knew the truth now. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. And yet, every attempt he made to pull her back only solidified her resolve. Lori didn't need him. She never had. One afternoon, as Lori sat in her office reviewing some paperwork, her phone rang. It was Tony. She glanced at the screen but didn't answer. The call went to voicemail. His message was predictable. "Lori, we need to talk. I made a mistake. Please, let's fix this. I'll make things right." Lori rolled her eyes, shaking her head. He was still trying to manipulate her, to draw her back into the cycle of emotional dependency they'd built together. But she was done. Done with the lies, done with the deceit. She deleted the voicemail, feeling a sense of peace settle over her once again. Later that evening, as she sat at her desk, Lori thought back on everything that had happened. She had been through so much betrayal, heartbreak, and pain. But she had also learned that the only person she needed to rely on was herself. The only future that mattered was the one she was about to create. "I am more than just the woman who feeds him," Lori whispered to herself. "I am the woman who controls her destiny." And for the first time in years, Lori truly believed it. It had been a week since the divorce papers had been officially filed, and yet Tony still couldn't wrap his head around it. The notion that Lori was no longer the woman he could control, that she had taken everything, her dignity, her wealth, and now the life he thought was his, was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. Tony Wallace had always believed he was the architect of their success, the one who guided their relationship with the power of his ambition. He had married Lori for her status, for the financial comfort her family's name had provided, but he had never imagined that his selfishness would come back to bite him in such a devastating way. He had thought Lori's wealth, her $250 million inheritance, was something he could take, manipulate, and eventually walk away with, especially once he filed for divorce and made it clear that he was tired of playing the part of a dutiful husband. Lori had always been quiet, always keeping to the background of their marriage, and Tony had taken advantage of that. She had been the breadwinner, the one who carried them through every rough patch. Tony had told himself that the money didn't matter. He had always believed the life he had with Lori was one of true comfort and success. But, in reality, Lori had always been the one who held the keys to their future. Her father's estate was built on decades of hard work, on investments and properties, businesses and assets Tony never understood. And now, Lori's wealth was shielded from him, legally protected under the trust her father had set up long ago. Lori had been playing the long game, and Tony had never seen it coming. He was about to lose everything. The day the court ruling came down, Tony felt the walls closing in. He sat in his lawyer's office, his palms slick with sweat, as he tried to absorb the implications of what was happening. The lawyer, a man who had promised him a fair shot at the divorce, now sat across from him, expression grim. "It's done," the lawyer said, his voice low. "The judge ruled in Lori's favor. She retains full control over the inheritance. You will receive nothing from the estate." Tony's mind raced. He had expected some kind of settlement, a compromise, a way for him to get at least a fraction of the Tatum family fortune. But this was complete defeat. "What do you mean, nothing?" Tony asked, his voice rising slightly. "I've been with her for years. I built a life with her, didn't I?" The lawyer shook his head. "Tony, I tried to warn you. Lori's father had set this up long ago. His estate is legally protected. The trust is untouchable, and you, unfortunately, don't have any claim to it. She's the sole beneficiary, and the prenup you signed clearly states that infidelity nullifies any claim to her assets." Tony ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the words crushing him. He had never paid attention to the fine print. He had never thought about the consequences of his actions. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that Lori would always be beneath him. But now the tables had turned, and Lori's inheritance, her power, had shut him out completely. "This is ridiculous," Tony spat, frustration boiling in his chest. "I've been loyal to her. I've worked with her, built this life. She can't just take everything and leave me with nothing." The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He shuffled through the paperwork in front of him, clearly uncomfortable. "Tony, there's more. We're also facing legal repercussions for your actions with the company funds. There's a possibility of a corporate investigation into the misuse of assets. If that happens, you could face serious financial penalties, on top of the divorce settlement." Tony's face paled. Misuse of assets? This wasn't just about losing Lori, it was about losing everything he had ever worked for. His pride, his ego, everything he had built had been linked to Lori and her family's wealth. Now, it seemed like everything was slipping away from him. "You need to prepare yourself," the lawyer said. "This isn't over, but I'm afraid you've already lost the most important thing, the inheritance. Your best bet now is to focus on minimizing the fallout from here." Tony sat back in his chair, stunned into silence. The inheritance. The one thing he had wanted most from Lori had now been secured away from him. He had no claim to it, no way to access it. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had been blind to the fact that Lori had been in control of their financial life from the very beginning. As Tony sank deeper into his despair, Lori was in a completely different state of mind. Lori had been through enough over the past few weeks. She had heard the court ruling, the whispered conversations between her lawyers, and now her new reality was becoming clear. The Tatum family wealth was hers, and Tony had no access to it anymore. It had been difficult, at first, to come to terms with her feelings about the marriage, about what it had been and what it had become. The anger she had once felt for Tony's betrayal was now nothing more than indifference. Lori had won, not by shouting, not by confronting him head-on, but by quietly taking control of everything that had always belonged to her. She had grown up in this house, among the Tatum family's legacy, and now she was standing in the middle of it. Lori stood in the drawing room of the family estate, overlooking the vast property that had been her father's. The estate wasn't just a place to Lori, it was a symbol of everything her father had worked for. It was a legacy of success, not just in wealth, but in family values, loyalty, hard work, and love for the land that had provided for them. But now, her inheritance was no longer about wealth, it was about the strength to stand on her own. As the weeks passed, Tony's financial collapse began to accelerate. The company's credit lines were frozen, and his personal accounts were slowly drained as the fallout from the divorce and his misuse of funds set in. Tony had lived his life believing that his success was a given, that he could always lean on Lori's wealth to soften his fall. But now, that wealth was completely out of his reach. His egotistical reliance on Lori, on the life she had provided for him, had backfired in the worst way. Lori, on the other hand, was quietly thriving. Her new venture in real estate was gaining traction, her business growing day by day. She had surrounded herself with a team of professionals who understood her vision, and she was taking her place as the head of her own empire. But the contrast between Lori's rise and Tony's fall wasn't lost on her. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't need to see Tony's suffering to feel fulfilled. But she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had seen through him all along. She had known this day would come, and when it did, she was prepared. It was late one evening when Tony came to her house, the house he thought he'd always have access to, the one he believed he could walk into at any moment and take whatever he wanted. He had been trying in his desperation to regain some of the wealth he thought he had lost. He thought if he just talked to Lori, just pleaded with her, she might show mercy. But when he arrived, Lori was already several steps ahead. "You're wasting your time, Tony," Lori said, standing tall in the entryway, her eyes cool and unwavering. "This isn't about money, this is about you trying to steal what was never yours." Tony opened his mouth to protest, but Lori didn't let him speak. "You lost, Tony. You didn't just lose me, you lost everything. You'll never get what you thought you could have from me. You never deserved it in the first place." Tony looked defeated, the weight of his own greed and ego crushing him. The man who had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his manipulation, now looked like a shell of the person Lori had once known. "Goodbye, Tony," Lori said softly, the finality of her words hanging in the air. "I'm done." Tony had once walked through life like he owned it all. His arrogance had been his armor, and his belief that Lori's wealth was merely a tool to build his own success had fueled his every action. But now, as he sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through bank statements and phone messages, the weight of his choices began to settle in. The divorce papers, now finalized, had shattered his sense of control. Lori had walked away from their life together not out of desperation, not in tears, but with calm, calculated resolve. He thought she would beg him to stay, that she would crumble beneath the emotional burden of their fractured marriage. Instead, he found himself flailing, unable to hold on to the life he thought was his by right. The silence in Tony's apartment was suffocating. He stared at his phone, willing it to ring with a call from one of his contacts, someone who could give him the lifeline he so desperately needed. His fingers hovered over the screen, but there was no reply, no voice on the other end to offer him solace. His investments were failing, his lifestyle was slipping through his fingers, and now Lori's absence meant the final nail in his coffin. The consequences of his actions had been swift, and they were relentless. Tony had never been one to think about consequences. He had always gotten what he wanted, but now his world was closing in. The house, the cars, the credit lines, they were all fading, just like Lori had. He had assumed the wealth Lori had inherited would always be part of their life. He was wrong. The real estate ventures he had once been so proud of had collapsed, their value plummeting as the market adjusted to the aftermath of his mismanagement. His attempts to take Lori's wealth, her $250M inheritance through the divorce proceedings had failed. Lori's lawyer, Matt Juggernaut, had shut him down at every turn, and now Tony found himself out of options. It wasn't just his finances that were failing, it was his identity. He had built himself on the idea that Lori was his ticket to everything, and now that she was gone, there was no one left to prop him up. At the same time, Lori was busy building something entirely different. She had reclaimed her life quietly, determinedly. Each decision she made was a step further away from Tony and everything he had represented. Lori wasn't just inheriting wealth, she was building her own empire. She had met with investors, real estate developers, and business partners who were as eager to work with her as she was to establish her future. The Tatum family fortune wasn't just about the money, it was the legacy, the reputation, and the influence that came with it. Lori had been given the tools, and now she was wielding them with precision. Her plan was simple, to create something that belonged only to her. No one, least of all Tony, was going to define her future. Lori was done being a shadow in someone else's world. She was stepping into her own light, creating a space where she would not just survive but thrive. As Lori moved forward with her plans, Tony's desperation grew. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of his financial downfall became impossible to ignore. His credit was frozen, and every business deal he had tried to salvage fell apart. His former colleagues and associates were beginning to distance themselves from him, no longer willing to offer him the support he had always relied on. One day, Tony stood in front of his apartment window, staring out at the city he thought he owned, wondering how he had gone from the man who had it all to the man who had nothing. The high-rise buildings glinted in the sunlight, a constant reminder of everything slipping out of his reach. He had gambled with Lori's heart, and now it seemed that everything was coming crashing down. The money, the houses, the lifestyle, it was all slipping through his fingers. And Lori? She had already moved on. She was no longer the woman who had begged for his love. She had taken control, and now she was building something that was all hers. Tony's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. He opened it to find his lawyer standing there, his face grim. "We need to talk," the lawyer said, stepping inside. "There's a serious problem." Tony had no idea what this was about, but the fear was already creeping into his chest. His lawyer sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out a folder full of documents. "What is it?" Tony demanded. "We've got an issue with your finances. The company's been investigated for misuse of funds," the lawyer said, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with concern. "We're facing penalties, and we need to talk about a defense strategy." Tony blinked, his thoughts swimming. Misuse of funds? He had been careless with the company accounts, using business expenses for personal indulgences, but he never thought it would come to this. "What do you mean penalties?" Tony asked, his voice tight. "Possible civil charges, Tony. If this goes to court, it could cost you everything. We need to prepare for the worst." Tony sat down, the weight of the words sinking in. Everything? Wasn't that what he had already lost? He felt the familiar sting of panic rising in his chest. His entire life had been built on a foundation of deceit and manipulation, and now the world was starting to unravel. Meanwhile, Lori had moved into a new phase of her life. The real estate deal she'd been working on was finally taking shape, and with it, her new business was beginning to rise. The empire she was building wasn't just for show, it was hers. The money wasn't the most important thing to Lori. It was the freedom to create something that was entirely her own. She wasn't just inheriting wealth, she was building wealth on her own terms. The divorce, the betrayal, everything she had been through had shaped her into someone who was no longer afraid. Lori no longer feared being seen as just another rich woman in the eyes of the world. She was no longer defined by what others expected her to be. The world had watched Tony make his move, his arrogance leading him to believe he could take it all. But now, the tables had turned. Lori was no longer waiting for permission. She was leading, building her own life with every decision she made. The final blow to Tony came when Lori's business venture began to gain recognition. Her investors were eager to work with her, and her real estate projects were rapidly becoming successful. In a matter of months, Lori had transformed from a woman on the defensive, fighting to keep her inheritance intact, to a woman on the offensive, creating a legacy all her own. Tony, by contrast, was drowning. His ego had been shattered, and the collapse of his finances became impossible to ignore. The bankruptcy filings began, and the creditors knocked on his door with demands he couldn't meet. His world was falling apart, and there was no one left to help him. The people he had once seen as his support network now looked at him as a failure. And Lori? Lori had already moved on. One day, as Lori stood in her office, looking out at the sprawling skyline of the city, a familiar name appeared on her phone. It was Tony. He had been calling more frequently in recent days, trying to apologize, trying to reclaim the life he had lost, but Lori had no intention of letting him back in. He had no place in her world anymore. She didn't answer. Instead, she let the call go to voicemail. The message was predictable. "Lori, I've lost everything. I was wrong. I should have never let you go. Please, I need to talk." Lori stared at the screen for a moment, letting the message sink in. Was this an apology? Or was Tony simply trying to crawl back into her life now that he had nothing left? But Lori wasn't the woman who needed to hear those words. She didn't need his apology, and she didn't need his validation. She had already moved on from him, from the life they shared, and from the illusions he had built around their marriage. "I'm not going back," Lori whispered, her voice steady. "Not now. Not ever." It had been a year since Lori Tatum walked away from her old life, the life that had been so tied to Tony Wallace's control. She could still remember the sterile smell of the hospital room, the helplessness she had felt as she lay there immobilized, waiting for anyone to notice what was really happening around her. She had spent so much of her life in that hospital bed, but today, Lori stood tall in the world outside. The changes in her life weren't just material, they were deep, personal, and permanent. Lori was no longer the woman Tony had once manipulated. She was no longer the woman whose worth had been defined by a man's gaze or approval. Lori now stood in her office, overlooking the city skyline, a view that had once been only a backdrop to the life she had been living, a life spent pleasing others, being the dutiful wife, and playing the role of the woman who had no control over her own destiny. But now, the world before her looked different. It felt wide open, and for the first time in her life, Lori could see that her future was hers to build. Her new venture, Golden Gate Real Estate, had officially launched. It was her baby, the realization of the dreams she had quietly nursed while being held back by Tony's indifference. The business wasn't just about properties or profits. No, this venture was about empowerment. Lori had worked hard to create a company that helped other women not just in real estate, but in every way possible. She wanted to show them that they could take control of their own destinies, that they didn't need a man or anyone else to define their worth. Her first few months had been a whirlwind. Lori had already established herself in the industry before, but now her name was starting to carry weight on its own. Clients were flocking to her company, eager to work with a woman who had built something from the ground up. They saw in her a vision, a strength that Tony had never bothered to understand. Tony, on the other hand, had become a footnote in her life. The man who once had so much power over her, the man who had used her, deceived her, and laughed at her expense was nothing now. His attempts to reach her had become a distant memory, a faded echo of the man who had tried to strip her of everything. Lori didn't need to revenge him. Her growth was her revenge. But the world around Lori wasn't just shaped by her financial success, it was about her transformation as a person. When Tony left, Lori's world had collapsed, but in its place, she had built something stronger, something real. She had found her voice and her power, both of which had always been inside her, but had been overshadowed by Tony's presence. At her new office, Golden Gate Real Estate, Lori had gathered her first team of women. It was a small group, but each one was passionate, driven, and eager to learn from her. Lori was giving them the same tools she had used to reclaim her own future, the tools that had taken her from an emotionally dependent wife to a self-sufficient businesswoman. She had built this empire from scratch, and now she was sharing it with women who had been overlooked by the world, just like she had been. Lori smiled as she looked out the window of her new office, the bustling city before her. There was a peace in this moment, one she had longed for since she first met Tony. He had taught her so much, though it had been the hard way. He had pushed her to realize that true strength came from within. Tony's absence had left a void, yes, but it had also created space. Space to grow, to evolve, and to finally become the woman Lori had always been destined to be. It was in the quiet moments like these, when Lori was alone in her office, her mind turning over the future, that the full weight of everything she had achieved began to settle in. She was free, truly free. No one was telling her what to do, no one was questioning her decisions, and most importantly, no one was defining her. Not her ex-husband, not her family, and not society. Lori had finally created a space where she could live for herself, where she could make her own decisions and watch them come to life. And that was worth more than any inheritance, any property, any amount of wealth. Later that week, Lori attended a real estate conference where she was invited as a featured speaker. It wasn't just her business accomplishments that had led to this moment, it was her story, her journey from vulnerable wife to empowered woman. As she took the stage, Lori's gaze swept over the crowd, people who were just starting their careers, others who had been in the industry for years. They didn't know her as Tony's wife, they knew her as a leader. And that felt more satisfying than she had ever imagined. When the applause came after her talk, Lori stood tall, her posture strong and proud. She had earned this moment. She had earned every step of her independence, every victory, no matter how small. After the event, Lori made her way to a quiet corner of the conference hall. Her sister, Reeve, had flown in from across the country to join her. Rev had been her rock through everything, the one person Lori could always count on. Lori didn't have many people left in her life, but Reeve was one of the few who had always been there. Reeve walked over to her with a big smile on her face. "You were incredible, Lori," she said, wrapping her arms around her sister. Lori returned the hug, her heart full. "Thanks, Reeve, it's still surreal, you know." Reeve pulled back, her eyes filled with pride. "Surreal? Lori, you've been building this empire for years. You were always meant for this. I'm just glad to see you finally owning it." Lori smiled softly. It was nice to hear those words, but she didn't need them to feel validated anymore. She had owned it for herself, and for the women who would come after her. As they left the conference, Lori and Reeve took a moment to sit on a bench outside. The air was cool, and the evening sky was just beginning to darken. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, Reeve," Lori said quietly. "About Dad, about the family legacy, and about Tony." Reeve raised an eyebrow, sensing where the conversation was headed. "I know that look. What's going on?" Lori let out a long sigh. "Tony's absence has made me realize how much of my life I was letting him control. Not just with the marriage, but with my family's wealth too. For so long, I thought it was all about him, about us. But it's not. This what I'm doing now, it's mine." Reeve smiled, her eyes gleaming. "You've always been strong, Lori. I think you just needed to remember that." Lori leaned back, looking up at the stars starting to emerge in the sky. "I spent so many years believing I was nothing without him, but now I know better." Reeve's voice softened. "You've always had it in you. It just took someone else's betrayal to wake you up." Lori smiled faintly. "I guess sometimes it takes a slap in the face to make you realize you're worth more than you thought." Reeve chuckled. "And look at you now, you're unstoppable." As Lori looked out at the city skyline from the bench, she couldn't help but reflect on everything she had gone through. The betrayal, the divorce, the pain, all of it had shaped her into the woman she was now. But it wasn't the pain that defined her. It was the fact that she had moved forward, that she had taken control. She wasn't the woman who needed Tony's approval, his love, or his validation. She had built something stronger, something that no one could take from her. As she and Reeve made their way back to their hotel, Lori's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Tony. He had been calling her more frequently in recent days, trying to apologize, trying to worm his way back into her life. But Lori wasn't interested. She had no need for him anymore. She knew what Tony wanted. He wanted a second chance, a chance to continue using her. But Lori wasn't playing that game anymore. She was moving forward without him. Later that night, Lori stood on the balcony of her new office building, looking out over the glowing city lights below. The world was moving around her, but Lori knew one thing for sure. Her life was in her hands now. She wasn't waiting for anyone to tell her what to do. She was leading her own life. The final words of her father's legacy echoed in her mind. "You don't need anyone to define you, Lori. You're stronger than you know." And in that moment, Lori knew that he was right. She had never needed anyone else to complete her. She had always been enough. As the year progressed, Lori's life continued to unfold in ways she had never imagined. The real estate empire she had dreamed of was now a thriving business, and her name was becoming synonymous with empowerment, success, and strength. Lori didn't need Tony anymore. She had never needed him. Her family's $250M inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was about legacy, the kind of legacy that she had inherited not just from her father's wealth but from his values. It was about self-reliance, about being able to stand on your own 2 feet and take control of your future, no matter the obstacles. But the road Lori had traveled was not an easy one. She had been broken, betrayed, and left vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, she had found the power to rebuild. The emotional scar left by Tony's betrayal had only strengthened her resolve. Lori stood in her new office, overlooking the city skyline. The view from her floor was breathtaking, a reflection of the world she was now a part of. She had always dreamed of making a mark, of building something of her own. And now, that dream was real. She had turned her pain into purpose, her grief into growth. Every day, she worked tirelessly to expand her business, and every day, she proved to herself that she was more than the woman Tony had once claimed. Her phone buzzed, a reminder of another milestone. A prominent magazine had contacted her for an interview, the kind of opportunity Lori had longed for but never thought would come. It was a huge moment, but it wasn't just about the recognition. It was about the message she had always wanted to send. You don't need to rely on anyone but yourself to succeed. Lori had always believed in the power of independence, but now she understood it on a deeper level. It wasn't just about money or the ability to stand alone, it was about ownership. Owning her choices, owning her actions, owning her legacy. A few days later, Lori stood in front of the camera for the magazine interview. She was wearing a sharp black suit, a subtle but deliberate choice. She wasn't here to play small. She wasn't the same woman who had once thought she needed Tony's approval to feel valid. She had already proven herself, and now, the world was going to see just how far she had come. The interviewer asked questions about her rise to success, about the challenges she faced, and about the personal journey that led her here. Lori answered with confidence, never looking back at the woman she had been. She wasn't interested in the past anymore. She was done being defined by her circumstances. "I've learned that true power comes from within," Lori said, her voice steady. "It's not about what anyone else thinks of you. It's about knowing who you are and standing by that no matter what." As the interview wrapped up, Lori felt a wave of satisfaction. Not because of the recognition, though that was nice, but because of the realization that she was living her truth. She had worked hard for this moment, and now she was standing tall in it. But as the interview ended and Lori walked back to her office, she couldn't help but think about Tony, not with anger, but with clarity. He had tried to break her, tried to make her believe she was nothing without him, and now, after everything, Lori could say without hesitation that she had won. Tony had been her biggest lesson. He had shown her exactly who she didn't want to be. He had used her, manipulated her, and tried to take her down at her lowest point. But in the end, it wasn't Tony's money or his presence that gave Lori strength. It was her own resilience, her own ability to fight for herself. And the final act of closure came when Tony showed up at her office, a year after everything had fallen apart. Lori had known this day would come. She had prepared herself for it, but she wasn't prepared for the pitiful man who stood before her now. Tony had lost everything. The lavish lifestyle, the connections, the life he thought he could inherit, it was all gone. His pride had been his downfall, and now he stood before her, looking nothing like the man who had once walked out of their home with such confidence. "Lori," Tony began, his voice low, "I'm sorry, I've lost everything. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" Lori didn't flinch. She had no desire to hear his apologies. She had heard them all before, and they had meant nothing. What she had done in the past year was proof enough of her strength. She met his gaze, cool and unyielding. "There's nothing left to talk about, Tony." His face fell, and Lori felt nothing. No anger, no frustration, just peace. She had already moved on, and the man standing before her was no longer the person she had loved. "I don't need you," Lori said softly but firmly. "I haven't needed you for a long time." It was in that moment that Lori fully realized how much she had grown. The power she had found in herself had always been there, waiting to be recognized. And now, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. A few weeks later, Lori stood on the balcony of her new office, overlooking the city she had come to call her own. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the buildings below. Lori took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past year settle into the horizon. She had done it. She had taken the pain, the betrayal, and the loss, and transformed it into something beautiful. She was no longer the woman Tony had tried to break. She was Lori Tatum, a woman with a vision, a woman with a future. As Lori watched the city lights flicker on, she couldn't help but smile to herself. This was only the beginning. The world had no idea who she was becoming. She had taken control, and now the world was hers for the taking. Before we move forward, if Lori's journey has hit something deep inside of you, something that made you believe in your own strength and power, take a second right now. Tap like, hit subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear how Lori's story resonates with you. And if you want to see more stories about empowerment, growth, and self-reclamation, check out the 2 videos pinned right here on screen after this one. 1 year after Lori Tatum had reclaimed control of her life, she stood at the top of the city, watching the sun dip behind the skyline from her new office. The Golden Gate real estate venture she had founded from scratch had surpassed her wildest dreams. Lori had made it a successful businesswoman, a woman of power, and a force in a world that had once tried to suppress her. But as she stood there, overlooking everything she had worked for, she realized that this was just the beginning. The $250M inheritance had been the catalyst, yes, but it wasn't the money that had made her strong. It was the decisions she made, the choices that had pushed her to stand up and fight back, to take ownership of her future, and to stop being defined by the men who had tried to control her life. It had all started with the betrayal, a betrayal that had torn her apart but also gave her the opportunity to rebuild stronger than ever. Lori had worked tirelessly over the past year, watching her empire grow. The real estate projects she spearheaded were successful, but more than that, she had built something that would last. A company founded on empowerment, dedicated to helping women find their own voice, their own financial independence, and their own paths in life. She had never wanted to be just another rich woman in a sea of wealth and privilege. Lori wanted more than that. She wanted to change the game for other women who had been overlooked, marginalized, and trapped by the same systems that had once held her back. She wanted them to see what was possible, to show them that they could take control of their futures too. Her first major client was a woman named Sienna Cross, a rising star in the tech industry who was looking to invest in women-centric spaces. Together, they worked to develop a series of commercial properties designed to empower women entrepreneurs, spaces where they could collaborate, learn, and grow. Lori had built something tangible, something that would leave a lasting impact. But it wasn't just the business success Lori was proud of, it was the feeling of freedom, the freedom to make her own decisions, to create something that reflected her vision for the future, a future she no longer had to share with Tony. As she signed contracts, reviewed proposals, and met with clients, Lori felt powerful in a way she never had before. There was a quiet confidence in her now, a confidence that came from knowing who she was and what she could achieve. She wasn't the woman Tony had tried to mold. She wasn't a supporting character in someone else's story. She was the main character of her own. But even as Lori grew stronger, Tony's actions still lingered like a shadow over her. His attempts to call her, to apologize, to crawl back into her life, it all fell on deaf ears. Lori had already moved on, not just from him, but from the life they had shared. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need him at all. Her growth was her revenge. There was a part of Lori, however, that still couldn't shake the echoes of their past. She thought back on their time together, the way she had allowed him to take so much from her. How she had allowed him to define her life for so long. The emotional betrayal, the way he had manipulated her into thinking she needed him, that hurt, yes, but it had also set her free. She had turned her pain into something powerful, something that would not only change her life, but the lives of women everywhere. And she knew that, as much as she might have once loved Tony, she had outgrown the woman who had let him define her. As Lori stood by the window, looking down at the busy streets below, she heard the faint chime of her phone. It was a message. She picked it up, her heart rate steady as she saw it was from Matt Juggernaut, her attorney. "I know we've been waiting on this news for a while, Lori. I've just received the final ruling on the company funds. You're cleared for your next move. Everything is in place, and Tony will have no access to any of your wealth. Your future is completely secure." Lori couldn't help but smile. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the freedom, the absolute freedom to move forward, to make choices for herself without fear or hesitation. She had taken control. She had made it. Later that evening, Lori stood on the balcony of her office, the city lights twinkling below her like diamonds scattered across the horizon. The breeze ruffled her hair as she breathed in the cool evening air, feeling the weight of everything she had been through settle into the fabric of the city. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Reeve, her sister, who had been by her side through every step of this journey. "Hey, Lori." Reeve's voice sounded cheerful on the other end. "You're killing it out there. I just saw the article about you in the Real Estate Journal. You're everywhere." Lori smiled. "I can't believe it either, but you know I'm just getting started." Reeve laughed. "I think you've more than earned your place at the top. I'm proud of you, Lore." The words from her sister hit harder than she expected. Proud. For so long, Lori had been the one making everyone else proud. She had always played the role of the supportive partner, the one who helped others rise. But now, Lori was standing at the top of her own mountain, looking down at everything she had built. And it felt damn good. "I couldn't have done it without you, Reeve," Lori said, her voice soft. "You were always there when I needed someone to hold me up." "You don't need anyone else now, Lori. You've got this," Reeve said, her voice filled with pride. "And you've got your future in your hands. There's nothing holding you back." Lori stood there for a long moment, her phone still in her hand, looking at the glittering city in front of her. For the first time, she realized that everything she had gone through, the betrayal, the heartache, the struggle, had led her here, to this moment of freedom. But there was still something else Lori had to do. The next morning, Lori walked into the Tatum family estate, the place that had been home for so many years. The air was thick with history, and the walls seemed to hum with the presence of generations before her. This was where her father had built everything, where his legacy had been shaped. She had spent so much time running from her past, hiding from the pain of what Tony had done, but now, Lori knew that the legacy of the Tatum family was hers to carry. It wasn't just the money or the properties, it was the strength her father had shown throughout his life. The legacy wasn't just about wealth, it was about resilience, and Lori had inherited that. Later that afternoon, Lori stood in front of the Tatum family portrait, the one that had hung above the fireplace for years. It had always been there, a reminder of the power her father had built, the empire he had created from nothing. Lori stood in front of it, taking it all in, feeling the weight of her future settle over her shoulders. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself. "I've always been ready." As Lori turned to leave the room, a thought lingered in her mind. What's next? And the answer came easily. It was time to continue building, to continue growing, to continue pushing forward.